Welcome to Cut the Bull, an insightful podcast which addresses the news of the day and the cultural issues plaguing our society, bringing logic and context to these topics and discussing solutions too real for mainstream pundits. Now, here are your hosts, Charles Love, Shamika Michelle, and Wilfred Riley.
I want a billion fans, so I need a million first. I'm a gain another
Hello and welcome to Cut the Bull. I am Charles Love, alongside my co-hosts, Shamika Michelle and Wilfred Riley. And our guest this week is Dansky. She is a public speaker, writer, and consultant committed to protecting women's rights and the author of The Abolition of Sex. Kara, welcome to the show.
Thanks so much for having me.
So obviously this topic has been, everywhere as of late, and you are one of the kind of authorities, people that other people reference. I may get to that later because that's a funny story. But I, reached out to you because I thought it was important to talk about this. It comes up in some of our conversations a lot, but we've never really just, spent the whole hour talking about this issue and why it's important and how it relates to women and feminism. So I guess we should start with the book, why you wrote it and why you see it as such a problem that you are, ringing the bell and making sure everybody understand how big this problem is, as opposed to it's just people dressing up, I guess, right? As some people may think it is. So what is the problem?
Thanks so much for asking, Charles. Yeah, no, this is a real problem. It's a problem that's been going on for decades, and most of us haven't known about it until quite recently. I became aware of how serious the problem was in 2014, and I started talking about it in 2015. And basically what's going on is that the United States government and many state governments and local governments are redefining the category of sex to include gender identity. And that sounds kind of academic, but what it really means is that men are allowed to be in women's bathrooms, women's locker rooms, women's changing rooms, women's prisons, women's domestic violence shelters and rape shelters. We are actually, as a matter of law and social policy and public policy, obliterating women and girls as a coherent category. And that really matters to me as a feminist because I care about all women and girls. And it also matters to me because I care about public policy being grounded in material reality and science. And my point in my book that I try to make is that I really want everyone to understand that the primary victims of this are women and girls, but everyone is ultimately going to be affected. All the men and boys are ultimately going to be affected by the abolition of sex, which is the title of my book.
Well, I think one thing that's unique about the way you approach it is you talk about all of the ways that it's happening and all of the ways that it's a problem, but you focus a lot on the legal, like you mentioned. You focus a lot on government and laws and protections that are eroding because of it. And I think that's an interesting thing. And one important thing you did touch on in your book, but I've been mentioning this a lot because people don't know and don't talk about it, and it's the Equality Act. And they tried to pass that several times, obviously. And the most recent one in 21 got 224 co-sponsors in the House and 48 in the Senate. And it's for those who don't know, it's adding gender and gender identity specifically to amending the Civil Rights Act to add that. And when I mention it to people, I know there's a lot of discourse now, especially around race. And I use that, mentioning it to my friends and close family, and they're shocked by it, right? So whatever their political beliefs are, the thing that fascinates them the most is when I tell them, so you talk about racism being systemic in America, and we need to stop this, and it's a problem. But now these politicians in large numbers are supporting an act that, like you say, Kara, is going to be harmful to women. But let's look at the Civil Rights Act, the whole point of passing it. Right? It is negating that, right? Because now you're saying that a person's gender identity, whatever they identify as, has the same protection. And in a sense, you're saying has been treated in the same repugnant manner as blacks during slavery and afterwards. So you're equating that. A lot of people say that it's unfair to equate the LGBT movement with that, but this is a totally different thing. So I think that is something that most people don't talk about in addition to the trans thing. So Shamika, do you think people in your circle, you talk to a lot of black people like I do you think that they even know that there is a push to pass this law? And what do you think they would say about that?
I absolutely think they don't know, like for sure. And I think they would have an issue with it. I did a video back in, I think, 2016, where I said gay is not the new black. And I wasn't even talking necessarily about trans people or whatever, but it was right. Maybe was it 15 when the whole bathroom issue came up, and I did some videos then. So it's kind of like an ongoing thing where people felt like this was ridiculous that men wanted to be in women's restrooms. And so even when I said gay is not the new black, so many people were agreeing with me that this is not the same struggle, and they don't like the idea of it being put in the same category when you talk about minorities or, marginalized people. They don't like that idea. So I think if they knew exactly the extent to which this was happening, they would really have something to say about it.
Will, I know you're a status guy. What do you want to say either about the Equality Act or just the premise that Kara is pointing out of the abolition of sex?
Yeah, well, my take on this isn't a stats take. And by the way, in terms of Shamika's point, I don't really see the trans issue as equivalent to the gay rights issue, which we can debate back and forth. I'm pro-gay rights. But interestingly enough, right after announcing that I'm quite pro-gay rights, I also happen to be a feminist in at least the second or third wave sense. And I mean, I think that the idea of gender itself is an incredibly bizarre and potentially damaging idea. This actually grew out of something totally qualitative, which was sort of Judith Butler, Money, people like this writing in the 70s and the 80s. So, I mean, when you talk about the Equality Act, or when you talk more broadly about adding gender identity to the definition of sex, Kara might correct me on some of this, but I mean, gender, bluntly stripped of all the faux academic language, is how masculine or feminine you feel in terms of like cultural stereotypes. So this actually is totally counter to kind of traditional feminism. I think this is why so many almost radical feminists like Kathleen Stock, so on. I mean, Helen Joyce is hardly a conservative, but are kind of jumping in to the fight against sort of gender identity in the law. And the distinction, I think, is that one of the core feminist ideas was, a woman needs a man like a fish needs a bicycle. Like, as a woman, I can do anything. I'm not bound by these stereotypes. Like, if I'm a tough basketball girl, or if I want to be a lawyer, I can do that. The idea of gender identity is that if you define yourself as a woman, or a man, I guess, in terms of these kind of set social stereotypes and norms, then you are. And that's an incredibly broad, sweeping idea that strikes me as batshit crazy, bluntly. Like, I don't really have a polite kind of center-right take on that. The idea is like, so me right now, weighing like $195 with the beard, if I were to go through a couple of days where I experience sensitive feminine feelings and ask many of my non-rad feminist friends whether that made me a woman, I know at least 3 people that would say yes. So we're not just talking about acceptance of people's public pronouns or something like this. I don't ramble on about this, but like all these cases, like the Leah Thomas situation, the best adolescent male cyclist ever in British history now identifies as a woman, and there's this big debate about whether he can compete in the British cycling nationals, where he would shatter the women's record, by the way, break it by like 1:49 seconds. All that comes from the correlation of sex and gender, where if you identify as a woman or as a guy in this kind of normative, stereotypical way, you're treated as this in terms of sex, like bio-sex. And that seems absolutely nuts. I mean, you can have a penis, a B6'5", like women. Like there have been male rapists sent to women's prison, at least in the UK and Australia. and you can be a woman because of this sort of normative identification. So I think this is very different from can gay people marry, something like that. You can support or oppose that, but that really has very little broad impact on how we use language day to day. This does. This is something that's really weird to me. And I'm not an especially easily shocked person, but it's the idea that however you define yourself is your reality. This is the core idea of kind of the left-wing qualitative social sciences. So there's no statistical response.
Right.
Other than this
Karen,
is
do
like
you want
100% BS. I guess that's a stats response.
Kara, do you want to, before we move on, comment on any of our comments or correct us where we may have been wrong?
So there's so much there. There's so much there. So let me go backwards. Will, and I want to say this and then let it go and not belabor it. I don't think a man can be a feminist. Let's just let that go and agree to disagree. Let's just agree to disagree.
It's not really something I care about that much, to be honest.
But we are going to come back to that because we're going to talk about feminism just because we're talking about feminism. But go on.
Okay. So
how do you know I'm a man?
I am gravely concerned. I'm gravely concerned. And also, Will, it is not just in the UK that men are being housed in women's prisons. It is happening all throughout the United States. As far as I know, 49 states, plus the District of Columbia where I live, have policies on the books that allow men to be housed in women's prisons with varying degrees of criteria that they need to satisfy. In some states, like California, Washington, and Oregon, they simply need to announce that they are women in order to be housed in a women's prison. In other states, they have to satisfy other criteria, like getting various surgeries and hormones and things. The states all vary, of course, because that's where we live and that's what happens in the United States. But in 49 states, as far as I know, men can be housed in women's prisons, and they are. It's happening in Illinois. It's happening in Kansas. I mean, I can document all of this stuff. It's not just overseas. It is happening here today. And so backing up into Charles's original questions about the Equality Act, I think it is really awful. And I want all Americans to be very concerned about what's going on here, which is that the 1964 Civil Rights Act was passed to accomplish a lot of objectives, but one of its main objectives had to do with Title II of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which is about public accommodations, which was intended to annihilate Jim Crow racial segregation throughout the United States. And I'm glad that it did, right? Most of us living today have no personal recollection. I don't have any personal recollection of racial segregation in public accommodations. When I go into a women's restroom in a hotel or a restaurant or a train station or whatever, I encounter all sorts of women of all sorts of racial backgrounds, all sorts of religious backgrounds. No one asks any questions. Like, we're all good. Like, women tend to be all good with each other in the bathroom for the most part. We don't cause anyone any problems. And racial segregation in public accommodations is utterly unimaginable to me. And what the Equality Act would do is hijack that victory of the civil rights movement and co-opt it for men who want to occupy women's spaces in public accommodations. And it's really, really bad. It's bad on all sorts of levels. I want to agree with Will on his points that this is not about gay. I am completely supportive of gay rights and lesbian rights and the rights of bisexual people. So I completely agree with Will on the points that he raised about that, even though I disagree with him on some other things. I hope I covered the things.
Yes. Yes, good.
Yeah, can I make one quick comment there?
Yes,
yeah,
sure.
not about like male feminism. I mean, that's something I do identify as, but it's about 129th on the list. I think women would probably be a little more identified as feminist than me. But the one thing the point Kara just made about people piggybacking on the civil rights movement and even the early feminist movement is very real. This happens all the time. So, I mean, this is back to the 1970s now, but the reason we have birthright citizenship in the United States is that the 13th, 14th, 15th Amendments of the Constitution granted the rights of citizenship to former slaves and also some former indentured servants. And one of those is the idea that if you have children in this country, you can't enslave them or bind them for 23 years. They're just citizens. So a left-leaning Supreme Court decided that this extended to any child born in the USA. So whether you support this or not, if you have two illegal immigrants in the country and one of them gives birth, that child is an American citizen. There's a considerable debate about the morality of this, but I think that we can all understand that that's not what, Abe Lincoln and General Sherman and so on intended 150 years ago. And this is the same thing. So you're starting to see, like, NBC News ran this just bizarre story. We should celebrate Leah Thomas, nee William Thomas, the way we celebrate Jackie Robinson. That was the quote. So the idea was that there was an all-white baseball league, Irishmen and Italians, Dutchmen, no blacks. Jackie Robinson took the hits, literally. He integrated one of the nation's heroes. Now, Leah Thomas is going into an all-female, segregated system and cracking the doors open. Just to me, and I'm interested in all three of your takes on this, but the difference is racial segregation was bad because the races are basically the same. Unless you're a hard IQ hereditarian, you can make jokes about sports and so on, but the idea is that black, white, native, so on, men or women do pretty much the same thing as people the same age and sex in the other group. But men and women are not necessarily the same. It's really understandable why you might want a mostly, if not all male military college or a women's restroom where you don't have to worry about guys. So this civil rights language is being very explicitly used, like Leah Thomas is our Jackie Robinson. Rachel Levine is the groundbreaking woman of the year. And that's kind of going to be, I think, how this gets into the mainstream if, bluntly, we lose this fight. It's going to be, how could you oppose equal rights, you bigot? How could you oppose compassion? How could you be for conversion therapy? That's how, for example, transgender surgeries for kids are being justified. So this is it's a tough wave to fight.
Kara, this is how I want you to address that. Will makes a point, but he hit on something that must be discussed, and it's media, and you write about it in your book. And I think it's important to talk about. Now, you highlight really well what the problems are, how it harms women, how it's unfair, as Shamika and Will said, because it was Shamika's point. Let's not steal her point, that it hijacks the great work we did to make the races equal. But there's another problem. Setting all that aside, I wonder why, one, we are being held to all buy into it, and if you don't, you get canceled and all the other things we talk about. And while the media, which is so strong, is not only buying into it, they're pushing it. Like Will said, that headline about comparing Leah to Jackie. But, you use some examples in your book, but it's also the fact that the media use these pronouns and they turn things and they trip over themselves to do it. I thought you were in New York. You said you were in DC, so maybe you didn't hear the story. I'd love to hear what Shamika says because I sent it to her. So there was a recent story about 3 weeks ago in New York City. So there was a man who had been arrested and convicted on 2 murders. So for some reason he got out. He was convicted. They commuted a sentence. He spent a lot of time in jail, but he got out. He did like 40, 50 years. He's an 83-year-old man. Come to find out, he met a woman on social media, killed her, dismembered her body, and was riding around in a hover round wheelchair, sitting on the leg he cut off. Right. So they call him. They arrested. It's a horrendous crime and all that. But the point here is, when the news reported it, it's probably if you wrote your book later, it would be top of the list in your book. They kept saying she. So they were like, this shocking, horrendous crime. She met this woman and killed her. She cut up her body and she rolled around with this, right? So that's bad enough that they think this is so important while they're doing, and they paused because they had to fix themselves to do it. But you ready for the kicker, Kara? She never changed the name and it was still Harvey. So they put up a picture of Harvey. And they kept saying she, Harvey. So they couldn't really get themselves to say she and say Harvey. But what's interesting is it was so important to use the right pronoun and not offend the 3-time murdering psychopath who rode around on the lake. So I ask you, you documented in your book, but I asked you why? Why do they make such a concerted effort to, buy into this and force you to believe, you, Joe Public, to believe it's normal, right? Use the same pronouns that they use the terms that they use, celebrate the new Jackie Robinson and so forth, and say, if so, social media is already canceling people for not saying the right thing, but they either don't cover the millions of people who disagree with it, or if they do, they just act like, yeah, this is normal. Yeah, he can be a woman. What are you talking about? So why? So we know it's happening. They can no longer say it's not happening. Look at Disney today. Disney is now saying, we're going to stop saying boys and girls. We're going to stop saying ladies and gentlemen. We're going to do all this stuff just because we're mad at the law in Florida. Whether the law is right or wrong, we're going to go to this extreme, right? We're going to put all of this trans stuff into our kiddie films. So why? What is the end game? Why are they doing this?
So you brought up Disney. Disney's even worse than you even mentioned, Charles, because the current president of Disney, I learned this morning, she refers to her children, one as, quote, pansexual, and the other as, quote, transgender. And she is saying publicly that she took her minor child to a clinic in Southern California to have, she refers to her child as her son. And so we can infer that she's referring to her daughter. She took her the head of Disney took her minor daughter to a clinic to have her sterilized and mutilated. And she's referring to her daughter as her son. It is so much worse than most Americans even know. It is so vile. It is disgusting. What is the end game? I mean, I don't exactly know about that, but what I can say is that your question, Charles, why, is a great one. And I really, really want all Americans to ask that question. I want Americans to ask, why is this happening? Why are we referring to convicted murderers and rapists, male, as she? Why? I want Americans to have the critical thought that you're encouraging Americans to have. Why? Now, as to the answer to that question, there is a ton of money behind this. There is so much money behind this. This is not a civil rights movement. This is not the Black rights movement. This is not the women's rights movement. This is not a movement to secure the rights of people who need rights because they have been deprived of rights. This is not that. This is a top-down, very heavily funded movement to convince Americans that biological sex does not exist. That's why the pronouns. That's why. Because every time someone asks an American, every time some person who works at a company or at a nonprofit or whatever, they ask you to put your pronouns in your email signature, what they are asking you to do is spread the word that biological sex doesn't exist. It's really sinister. It's really deep. It's really well funded. And I apologize if I sound like a conspiracy theorist, but I'm not. This is all documentable. This is all out there. It's all out there. It's just that the media will not talk about it.
Shamika, I want to know what your views are on this and ask you, because you are in the know, you keep your finger on the pulse. When did, based on what Kara told me about Disney, it's worse than I said. So what are your thoughts on this? But I also want to know, I know he's retired, but when did Dwayne Wade become the president of Disney?
Right.
It took you a minute.
I was like, wait, did I miss something? Right. So I want to say that I feel like they always try to come in on the back of Blacks for everything that they want to push. And I think it is so that they can really pull on the heartstrings of Black people. They make everything surrounded by Blacks or slavery or our rights or being oppressed. Everything they want to push, they ride it in on the backs of Blacks. And I think that us as people, we really started to Like, they've been doing this for a long time. I can remember being young and saying things like, oh, she had a sex change, or oh, he had a sex change. When in actuality, and I got, locked out of Twitter last week for a while until I agreed to take a tweet down, that I said you can't change sex. If the chromosomes are what determines your biological sex, there's no way that you can actually change that. So then, therefore, a sex change does not exist. But they've just inched in little things, bit by bit, that we've kind of accepted when we should have put our foot down a long time ago. And now we're here. And I don't know when Dwayne Wade became the president, but I can say that when I saw her, I said to myself, this is why women shouldn't be in charge.
Kara, hold off on that one because that's for the end of the show. We don't want to shift though because I know you're ready to come through. You got something to say about that. But I saw your response when Shamika mentioned the Twitter thing. I saw your response when you said she got locked out of Twitter. So there's layers to this. So you say there's money behind it. You and Will pointed out the fact that there's a media presence that kind of shifts the way we talk about these stories. But then there's something that's on us on all this stuff, right? We are allowing this stuff to happen by kind of joining in on it, or like you say, Kara, putting it with your company. Say it's really cool if you put your pronouns. That was the first thing that got me. And I got to say this clear. I think the four of us, Kara's probably the hardest because she's in this fight and she's like, I'm throwing in my hand, I'm giving it, I'm not even going to fall for it. Because you even wrote something in your book about how Republicans are trying to stop the treatment that is harming women, good for them, but they're still acknowledging the transgender thing, and you push back against that. But I still would say most people are like, I don't want to change their ability to do whatever they want to do and that kind of thing, but because they spin this narrative to say if you're against what they're doing, how it's hijacking a narrative or how it's harming women, that you hate them and you want to take their rights. No, that's not it at all. And they're just saying this stuff to make you look like all the things that they label you as. But what it really comes down to is whatever Johnny wants to do. If Johnny wants to live as Lisa, that's a separate argument. But does Johnny get to force me to do it, right? So I always thought that you make a good point, both you and Shamika and Kara, talking about, I thought it was weird that whatever your views on this and live and let live or whatever, why would someone who obviously looks like a woman, why would Shamika looks like a woman, anybody who sees her thinks woman, why would she feel the need, even if you give them their argument, which I like to do is hard, not, the people I disagree with. So I want to live as a certain gender, so I put my pronouns so you know that even though I look like a man, I want you to call me a woman. But if you look like a woman and everybody's going to think you're a woman, why would you, Kamala Harris, why would you, Nancy Pelosi, why would you, woman at a corporation, need to put, she, her? Everyone's going to assume you're a woman. So even us doing that, like you talk about, Kara, in the corporate world, wherever else, we are pushing this narrative, even though we may not agree with it, because we think, well, this is just a way to be nice, to make these people feel better. And I want to get your response to this. I kind of alluded to it earlier, but it just made me think about it now. So, Kara, it is so awesome. It's perfect timing. So after you and I spoke about coming on the show, I got attacked on Twitter by the trans widows. So I had half people saying I was transphobic, and the trans widows, though, they were saying that I was a propagandist for transgender people. Because on my radio show, I had a guy who's living as a woman on, and I treated him with respect. Didn't agree with him, never said she, in fact, but treated him with respect, right? Whatever. And they felt that I was pushing the narrative. The point was to hear what people have to say, whether I agree with it or not. Like, I wrote a book against the left on the race issue, yet I had somebody come on and talk about how everything was racist. I didn't attack them because I don't attack people on my show. So they felt that I was supporting, this movement, which is not true. I even said something to Will when he tweeted something once. I said, oh, watch out. They're going to say that you're pro-transgenderism or whatever. So I say that to say, so while they're attacking me, they say to me, they retweet something you tweeted, and they said, you really should reach out to this woman and you should read her stuff and all this other stuff. I'm like, wait until they see who's coming on the show. So I am in no way saying this stuff is normative, that we should be pushing it, that any of this kind of stuff. I wanted people to hear what somebody who says they live as a trans woman say. It's like, lay out your case, right? And then we can have a discussion, right? I don't run from conversations, but at the same time, this movement is so what they're saying I'm doing is what you're doing, you the people who are putting pronouns in your signature, you the people who are saying that not pushing back against the narrative of the Jackie Robinson of women's sports, or saying why not just let them swim, why not just let them play, what do you have against that? I'm not saying that that's the case. I'm not saying that you could, like what Shamika said, being okay with people getting blocked from social media for just tweeting things that just make sense, that are just normative things. So I don't know what we as normal people can do. We can talk about that, but I think that we all, like I say about race, like I talk to people on the left saying, you can still be a liberal and you can believe what you believe. You haven't changed. Society has to change. So you need to be open enough to say, I want to fix the things that are wrong. I think that blacks are treated unfairly in some ways, but I won't allow you to say that every white person is a racist, because that's silly. This is the same thing. So you can say that certain things, equality for whomever, without saying that, yes, we can just let men just say, right? Not any post-op, not any, just say, today I just say I'm a woman, and we have to just, bow to them and say that's the case. So what do you think that people need to do that they're not doing outside of being aware? Obviously, we need to make them aware, but what aren't they doing and what aren't they saying to push back against this?
I do want to say about the situation involving trans widows. I did not see that Twitter exchange, so I don't know about it. I can't respond to it. But I will say, I do think that in this discussion, we're dealing with a situation where the so-called trans widows are really not being heard enough. And
True.
I really want their voices to be amplified.
And they went through a lot.
So
you talk about somebody who's
changing
gender and taking the money to pay for the surgery and all the things they had to deal with and what happened to the kids. I get that. But I don't see I'm on your side. Don't come at me and say that I'm supporting this. That just seems a little extreme to me. But I get you. Yeah, they do need to be heard.
That's all I'm saying. That's all I'm saying. What do we need to be doing? So I really feel like the main thing that all of us need to be doing is drop the language of the opposition. Just drop it completely. I don't say the word transgender unless I put it in quotes, transgender. Look, the bottom line is every single human being on the face of the planet is either female or male. We're all in the class of Amalia. We're all either female or male. Transgender is a made-up word to push forward a industry-driven movement to obliterate sex. And the best thing that we can do is to stop using the language. And we can talk with our neighbors and our friends and the people we see in the grocery store and in our churches and in our synagogues and in our PTAs and everything. Talk with people and say, do you know what's going on? Just talk with people. Do you know what's going on? Do you know that male convicted rapists are being housed in women's prisons? Do you know that men are competing in women's sports? What do you really think about Leah Thomas in the NCAAs? What do you really think about that? And if someone says Leah Thomas is a transgender swimmer, ask that person, when you say Leah Thomas is transgender, what do you mean by transgender? Make people define their terms, because typically when I ask normal, average, everyday people, what do you mean by transgender? They say, I have no idea what that means. And of course that's what they say, because no one knows what it means, because it's a made-up term. And as soon as they say, I don't know what it means, it's like, okay, well then why are you saying it? And we can just stop it. We can all collectively join together across the political aisle and stop this as normal, average, everyday Americans by stopping the language and talking to our neighbors and our friends and our relatives and everyone else we know.
You had a great exchange in your book about that, where you asked somebody that, and that's what they said. They're like, I don't know. I'm just buying in. So I agree with you. I say the same thing about other issues. But you mentioned political, so that's the last thing I want to say about that before we move briefly on to something else. Is that, so I asked you why it's happening and why they're doing it. Why is it just one party? Why is it the people who now other people, like you said, Republicans are saying, still buying into the language and kind of, let's give them their space, but push back against certain things. But why is it the people who are rabidly saying this is a good thing for everyone? The 224 people who supported the Equality Act, all of them were Democrats. Why is this a Democrat thing?
It is and it's not. I mean, there is so much money behind this movement, and this movement has bought the Democratic Party completely, but it's also bought the Republican Party. There was a so-called gender clinic in Texas that gave Republican Governor Abbott, I think, $150,000 last year. And shortly after they did that, he vetoed a bill that would have prohibited transgender surgeries in kids. So they have come for Democrats and they have bought Democrats, and it's awful. And I don't like that because I'm a Democrat. But they're coming for Republicans. And I told Tucker Carlson this. I hope he listened. They are coming for the right. They are coming for the right. Absolutely. And I'm gravely concerned that Republicans, for the most part, have not been stronger, even though I don't like it because I'm not a Republican. I don't like Republicans, but I am concerned that Republicans have not stood up stronger against this, and I'm hoping that they will. I keep working with my conservative friends on working on the Republicans in Congress. Please take a stronger stand. Please do more. Please do more to get this out of our laws.
Well, let me ask you this question, since you say you don't like Republicans. Does it, but this is a good question though, but does it change, obviously your views are your views, and I don't expect anybody to change what you believe. If you are true in your convictions, you shouldn't. But does it change how you think of them having this experience that you had, like being called the TERF, trans exclusionary, radical feminist, or, being labeled right wing? So we it's hard to get them because many of them don't want to come on because none of us are Republicans, but we're center right. But we tried for, to have a bunch of, liberals on the show. And when they come on to a person, many of them are still liberals, some openly. I'm still a Democrat. Some are like, I will never be a Republican, but I'm not a Democrat anymore. Politically, they don't know where they are, but they're still liberals. But the one thing they all have in common, and I want to know if it's the same for you, is that they did say that they kind of changed the way they viewed conservatives after seeing, experiencing the attack. So no, obviously we've had, Sasha on, who was in your book, a lot of people like that. So they've experienced some of these attacks. So they can see now firsthand how just voicing their views gets such an extreme reaction that they're like, they don't change politically, but they do understand how everything becomes political when it's not really. So has it changed your views on conservatives or Republicans?
So when I said I don't like Republicans, that was very tongue-in-cheek.
I know.
I grew up in, but I grew up in rural southeastern Ohio, very white. I grew up in a very liberal town, but it was surrounded by a very Republican conservative area. And I knew Republicans growing up all my life. My parents were Democrats and their best friends were Republicans, and they met once a month on a Saturday night to play bridge, and they would play cards and have cocktails, and they would talk politics and they would disagree. This is the 1980s because I'm old. They would, like my parents were very anti-Reagan and their Republican friends were very pro-Reagan, and they would have arguments about it, but they were lively arguments. They were friendly disagreements, and they would play cards and it would be fun. And so when I say I don't like Republicans, I don't actually mean that. I know lots of Republicans, and in the past couple of years, as I've been fighting this fight, I have gotten to know many women, specifically women, and some men, but mostly women on the right, registered Republicans, and I have developed some amazing long-term, I'm confident, really great professional relationships, but also friendships with women on the right, with whom I disagree on lots of things. But I really value their intelligence and I respect their positions. So I didn't need to be changed because I was already open.
Right.
I just disagree with them on lots of things,
right.
But I really value the personal relationships I've made with them.
Yeah, because the disagreement is fine. I mean, you can disagree with other Democrats. It's just that today it seems like the disagreement has been so vile, and you're not a human, and you hate people, and all right, and people tend to make it more than it should be, and I understand that, and that's good. But I want to leave with the feminist thing, so I'm going to get out the way and let the three of you get into this debate. You already set Will straight and said you're not a feminist. But I know that Will says he's a feminist, and I don't think Shamika is, and I don't know what I believe on it because I don't know what it means today. So before Will and Shamika gives a rebuttal, can you tell us what feminism is today? Because I think we're like in the 117th wave. We skipped a whole bunch of waves, and now we're on a whole different wave that I don't even understand. So what does feminism mean either to you, and do you think that the other feminists agree with what you think it means today?
So that's a huge question, and I can't handle it in a short period of time. But as far as I'm concerned, what feminism means is the complete liberation of women from patriarchy. Mm-hmm. That's the flattest, shortest answer that I can give. There's so many things to say about it, and I assume that Shamika and I probably disagree with a ton of things. And that's cool, that's totally cool. But yeah, no, as far as I'm concerned, I'm a second wave feminist. I consider myself a second wave feminist. I wasn't there in the 1960s and 70s, but I've learned from second wave radical feminism, and I agree with much of it, not all of it, but much of it. And I'm completely committed to the liberation of women from male domination. That's what it means to me.
And are any of before Will gets in there, are any of the feminist groups or the louder feminists today different from that? Would you say they're different from that, or you're unique in that, or is that what you still think most feminists believe?
No, I think that most what passes for mainstream feminism today is pathetic. It's pathetic, and I'm just appalled and disgusted by it.
I figured as much. I just wanted to hear it out of your mouth. Will, take it away.
Well, again, I mean, I don't spend a whole lot of time thinking about feminism, but in terms of what I mean, if I were to say I'm a feminist, the standard sort of cliche definition is you would, in most circumstances, pursue the equality of men and women. So, like, second wave feminism, first wave feminism focused on I don't really understand how I ended up defining feminism on this show. But I mean, first wave. Kara, I'm sure, has a very different definition, but first wave feminism focused on basic things like voting rights. I mean, second wave feminism, these are all incredibly, incredibly broad descriptions, but focused on sort of equal access to the workplace, crazy things like the idea women should sometimes have orgasms, so on down the line. And I mean, when you jokingly said there have been dozens of waves since, with people writing about a whole range of different issues that could be linked into feminism, fat is a feminist issue and all that. Well, what I mean when I say if someone called me a feminist, I don't object to that, sometimes use the label. I think that men and women are equal and should generally have equal rights. Now, when people say things like, we want to totally remove patriarchal domination, I think this gets into a lot of the vague stuff. And again, no hate for Kara. I don't think she has any hate for me. But this gets into a lot of the vague stuff I can't stand about the left. I mean, like, the goal is removing institutional white supremacy. And if you respond to that by pointing out, well, 8 of the 10 richest groups in the country are Asian or black, everyone's been equal by law since 1964. What are you talking about? It generally comes down to sort of these very broad generalities like, well, in this category, blacks underperform whites' test scores, and we think racism might have something to do with that. Similarly, because women are smaller and a bit smarter than men, like there are actual very empirical differences there, I don't think you could remove male or female dominance in different sectors of society without, say, killing all of the men or all of the women. And there are actually things like the Scum Manifesto that have kind of touched on that, like, do we really need these bastards around? So that's not what I mean. I don't think as long as most women are heterosexual, we're going to get to the, Amazonian utopian future that, bell hooks, for example, might occasionally write about. But anyway, that's it for me, probably for the entire history of the show on feminism. The one thing that I thought Kara said that was a good deal more interesting than some dude defining feminism is the language of the opposition. And I think this is a very valid point. Like, my guy Colin Wright has written a lot about this, where his argument would be if someone asked you, what are your pronouns? You would say, I don't agree with the framework that's producing such a silly question. And this is true of a lot of this. Like, the reason pronouns in bio has become an online joke is that most people are very identifiably the sex they are. Like, Shamika and Kara are obviously women. Attractive, normal-looking women, if you guys don't mind the comment from a member of the hated patriarchal overlord class. But I mean, just, it's sort of, there's no way that either of you guys would be mistaken for a dude. Myself and Charles, on the other hand, I think it's very unlikely someone would look at me in particular, you know, fat, muscular, face made for radio, beard, but then say, like, well, that's obviously a lovely lady. Well, I mean, Charles, you're a very manly man too, Charles.
Oh, okay.
You're strong warrior-like guy. But I mean, like, no, I mean, jokes aside, though, not that was a joke, but I think that the whole reason for the pronouns normalization is the idea that this would make trans people comfortable. That if everyone takes this step of announcing, here's what I am, like, I am obviously a male, it becomes just as normal for people who claim that they are something neither male or female to state, this is my gender-based pronoun. If I didn't say this bluntly enough, by the way, the idea of gender itself strikes every quantitative social scientist I know off the record as just that bullshit. The whole gender idea is that there's your sex, and then there's the performance of sex. So if you are a man, but you prefer to dress in stereotypically female clothing and grow your hair out long, you prefer males as lovers, so on down the line, you are a woman in some intangible sense. This is kind of last thing for me, but this is why people like Matt Walsh on the right have gotten an incredible amount of mileage out of the question of what is a woman. Because it's an extraordinarily simple question, but you can't answer it in gender terms. So I would say that a woman is someone with a all XX chromosomal order or something like that. Like, it's not especially hard to do. Female reproductive anatomy. But if you say, well, a woman is someone who identifies as a woman, you enter kind of this endless, almost Greek, sophistic type of cycle. So what are they identifying as? What is a woman? And if you actually pin someone down on this on the debate stage, what they'll generally eventually say, and this is what gender is at root, is, well, a woman is someone who fits the norms, they don't say stereotypes, that we have for a woman in this culture. And they'll go into the things I just described, like a woman plays with dolls, a woman doesn't know how to use weapons, a woman looks pretty, a woman is soft. When I feel soft and weak, then I am a woman. It 100% of the time, in my limited experience, is this. So I think just saying, well, I don't recognize that concept, is a very valid reply to a lot of this stuff. The one thing, and this really is the last comment, the one thing I would analogize this to is belief in God. Like, I'm not the most religious guy. And people will tell me, well, I understand that there is an intangible being that watches over me. What does that being look like? Well, that's almost impossible to describe. What do they tell you? Well, it sounds a lot like my own voice, but I know it comes from the Lord. When people start getting into these personal theories about themselves and how they are, I don't favor being cruel to them, but I don't think we need to pretend that this is absolutely valid to everyone else. And that's kind of the sense in which I think people should look at gender. Right now, we're treating gender as sort of a scientific reality, and that has there are a lot of problems that come downstream from that.
And we go now to Shamika, feminism and patriarchy.
Well, first I want to say that I agree with Kara and everybody on the panel. Like, I think we do have to stop buying into the verbiage that they've given us that makes absolutely no sense, which is what I have said I was going to do. Like, I'm not playing their game anymore. I'm tired of it. I'm sick of it. I wish Prince was still alive so we could drag him for this whole, I'm not a woman, I'm not a man. You're going to have to figure it out, Prince, because otherwise you and your Purple Rain need to go somewhere and sit down, figure it out. So I agree. I'm not using their verbiage anymore. Like, I just will not, because it's ridiculous. And when it comes to feminism, there are times when I think that maybe I agree with some of the things that feminists agree with or that they believe. But ultimately, when Kara gave the definition or her definition of what it was, and it was the complete liberation of women from the patriarchy, then I said to myself, oh, okay, then I'm not a feminist because
Are you
of
a
course
voting
I
and
believe.
orgasms feminist like me?
Yes.
Okay.
And
So,
actually mostly just the orgasms, because sometimes with the
not the voting?
voting, I feel like I would give up my right to take some of the rights of these other women that I see. But definitely I think orgasms should be equal across the board. But I think, of course, men should have the last say and be the head. So then I'm like, well, I guess I'm not a feminist. Yeah, that's about it. I remain the same. I think men should be in charge. And the more I see women like the lady from Disney or, some of this other the foolish things that I see, I'm just like, they're the blame. And I know in Kara's book, she says that we have to stop blaming women, but, I haven't gotten there yet.
Kara, you're on now. So I'm gonna give you an option. Remember the show Let's Make a Deal? You talk about the 80s and being old, so you remember that. So you got a door. You got a door. You don't know what's behind it, or you can take the item you can see. So you can respond to Shamika's, because I'm giving you the last word, view on feminism, or I have another interesting but deep question you probably can't answer in this short period of time. But it's gonna be interesting.
Can I say one last thing before Kara
Of
takes
course
the
you
last
can.
word?
Shamika Michelle.
I want to say I learned something tonight from Kara, that this right here is not just a Black woman thing, because when she got really into what she was saying, I was looking at her like, oh, that's not just a Black woman thing.
How do you know doesn't identify as Black?
Right.
I mean, so Shamika and I are going to disagree on the power question. I absolutely think that I'm sick of men in power. Like, I've kind of had it. I'm done after a couple thousand years. I'm done with men. But I do take the point that there are a lot of problems with. There are problems. There are just problems. But I've had it with men in power. I will say that. And then I will say, I'm like, orgasms are great. So like, that's cool. But I'm curious about what Charles's profound
You want the door, don't
question.
You know you want the door. You want the question. Can I give it to you?
I guess
here it is.
It's getting late.
Well, it's the last question. You can just give like a minute and a half, and we'll close on that. You write about the objectification and violence and the way women have been treated through history to kind of, in a point in this book even, because you want to basically explain that it doesn't take away your feminist bona fides because you have an issue with this weird thing that's going on, and to show how it's weird to kind of compare those two things. But I asked some other women that I know this question, and they were kind of like, I don't really know. I got to think about that. So we know that violence against women is a problem, and it happens. It always has happened. But we got all this weird stuff going on, the transgenderism, the porn, the TV, the easy access, all this other stuff. So I just want to know from a feminist standpoint, and in your view, as seeing all this in society, do you think that the situation, not overall, obviously things are better for everyone today, but do you think that the way women are treated is worse? Not necessarily this year, but even you can go a little bit before the Me Too up until now, the last decade, with all this movement. Do you think it's worse now than it was in 1950 or in 1960 in your second wave feminism? Or do you think it was worse then?
I mean, it's such a good question, right? Because at the time, I think the treatment of women was worse because it was coming from a right-wing patriarchal perspective that women needed to be owned by men privately. Today, it's worse because of the left-wing perspective that women get to be owned by men publicly in the forms of prostitution, pornography, and surrogacy. So I don't know if it's worse. It's different, but it's bad.
I like it. See, you did that in less than a minute. And I guess we will leave it there. She is Kara Dansky, author of The Abolition of Sex and writer and consultant committed to protecting women's rights. Kara, thank you for joining us.
Thank you all so much for having me.
I'm saving the day from you commies who let know you can't fuck with me. I got a country to say, God bless the US of A, land of the free and a home of the brave. God get all of the praise. I got a country to say, cause I'm Patriot J and I'm saving the day.